he texted back, Biden out by Monday. And afterwards, looking back, I had to wonder, how in the world did he know that? The message was, you're doing worse than your advisors are telling you. The polls are worse than you think. And Biden wasn't ready to go, but 10 days later, he stepped aside. I honestly believe that Donald Trump would not be president if not for Susie Wiles. Joe Biden always treated his staff very, very well. He was never a tough boss in that respect. And the Biden camp felt that Harris was terrible to her staff.
Hello and welcome back to the Americano Show. Today we're going to be talking about last year's election, which was, after all, an utterly extraordinary election in many ways. And it is brilliantly covered in a new book called Uncharted, which I've got a copy of it here. Wave it at the... Should I wave it there? Wave it there. It's out now in all good bookshops and, of course, on Amazon and so on. The subtitle is How Trump Beat Biden, Harris and the Odds in the Wildest Campaign in History. And it's a story I followed quite closely last year, but I learnt quite a lot from it, including some pretty amazing revelations. And it is written by Chris Whipple, who joins us now. Chris Whipple is already a New York Times bestselling author and a documentary maker. Chris, thank you very much for coming on to Americano. I'd like to start with the title of your introduction, which I think speaks to one of the big themes of the stories, which is what really happened with Joe Biden last year. And the title is, I'm going to bleep out one word, What the F Happened to This Guy, which is a quote from a friend of Joe Biden's, I think, who spoke to Joe Biden on the phone and even said that quote to Joe Biden on the phone. And this is one of the real themes of your book, is that the people around Joe Biden knew that something was wrong, and they just didn't know how to deal with his mental and his cognitive decline.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons why I felt compelled to write the book, not because I'm smarter than anybody else, but because I had sources at the highest levels of the Biden camp and the Trump camp, and I was able to get them in Kamala Harris's campaign as well. This was a best friend of Joe Biden's, who a few days after that fateful, disastrous debate against Donald Trump, when Biden froze and looked as though he was lost, maybe he was having a stroke, who knows? But it was a disaster. This friend of Joe Biden's looks at his phone and picks it up, and he says, "Hello, it's Joe." And his friend said, "Joe who?" And Biden cracked up. He laughed for 4 or 5 seconds, and then he said, "That's why I love you. You're a blanking wise guy." And he had this, he was all there, and his voice was strong. And his friend said to me, I had to ask myself, what happened to that blanking guy? Nobody knew what had happened that night. And the heart of the book is the stunning extent to which Biden's friends and inner circle were in this kind of fog of denial and delusion. They convinced themselves, they basically believed what they wanted to believe in spite of their lying eyes, as the saying goes.
Well, something you specialised in is writing about the gatekeepers, the people behind the most powerful people in the country. And in this book, the gatekeepers on Biden's side are Mike Donilon, Ron Klain, Jeff Zients, Jen O'Malley, what's her name? I've forgotten it now.
Jen O'Malley Dillon.
O'Malley Dillon, yeah. And those people, all between them, managed to sort of conspire not to stop Biden, even after the disaster debate for a few days. And that's one of the fascinating parts of your book, is that terrible phase where everything seemed to be going wrong from the night of the debate all the way through to the resignation. Give us a little bit of an insight there.
Even prior to the debate, Ron Klain, I wrote a book about White House chiefs of staff called The Gatekeepers. I knew Ron Klain pretty well. He told me in devastating detail just how disastrous the debate preparation was at Camp David, the presidential retreat in the days prior to that disastrous debate. Biden was out of it. He couldn't follow the back and forth between his campaign and Trump's. He didn't really have anything to say about his second term plans. At one point, he wanders off and falls asleep in a lounge chair by the pool. And yet, they kept sailing toward the iceberg. They had this debate. Now, one thing that makes all of this so fascinating is that you would think if this were a classic so-called cover-up on the part of Biden's inner circle and advisors, that they never would have gone ahead with that debate. If they all knew that he was incompetent, non-compos mentis, unable to hold his own on a debate stage, they could have waited until the fall. They could have run out the clock, as it were, but they went ahead with that debate. I think they deluded themselves. They were hoping for the Joe Biden who showed up at the State of the Union famously the previous year and did so well. And of course, this was quite the opposite.
And that's partly because of Biden's long career in politics, where he has always seemed, or had always seemed, slightly shambolic. He's always had the stutter and so on. But as you say, he was thought to be a game day performer. In the clutch moment, Joe Biden would always come out. And his closest advisors still believe that, even though they'd seen how bad things were at Camp David.
Yeah, I mean, it was a kind of a Hail Mary pass, to use the American football expression. They knew, Biden camp, that if the election was a referendum on Joe Biden, they would lose. If it was a choice between Joe Biden and this monster named Trump, they could win. And so they wanted to have that face-off as soon as they could possibly get it. They got it. And boy, did they regret it.
Yeah. Well, the book also deals with the Trump side of the equation. And of course, a key figure now is Susie Wiles, his chief of staff. And she was very, very important in the campaign. But you also look back to 2016 and really a sort of part of the campaign that's forgotten about in 2020, which is Brad Pascali, who was campaign manager for a few months of the Trump campaign in 2020. And it was a complete disaster. There was terrible infighting and so on. Can you remind us a little bit about the Brad Pascali story?
Yeah, Brad Pascal is one of just this rogues gallery of campaign managers and advisors who have worked for Trump on campaigns over the years. And those first two campaigns, 2016 and 2020, your listeners and viewers may recall that Trump just went through them left and right. It was a revolving door. He would fire them seemingly on a monthly basis, not quite that often. But what was different about 2020 is that Susie Wiles had a kind of magic with Donald Trump. She really had a relationship with him that worked, unlike all of her predecessors. And part of this her story is fascinating, and I write all about her in Uncharted. Their relationship her magic with Trump goes back to her childhood. Her father was Pat Summerall, a famous American sportscaster who was also an alcoholic. She learned something about how to deal with difficult men. She and Trump bonded over their mutual contempt for Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. I also get into that in the book. And in the end, she was able to run a campaign that was remarkably competent, unlike the preceding campaigns. And I honestly believe that Donald Trump would not be president if not for Susie Wiles.
Mm. But there was, as you get into, there was quite a lot of fractiousness behind the scenes. And of course, people tend to forget about the fractiousness if the candidate goes on and wins. Whereas if Trump had somehow lost, and of course he didn't lose by quite a long way, but people would have pointed towards the infighting between, say, Corey Lewandowski, a long-time Trump loyalist, his campaign manager back in 2016, and Susie Wiles and Chris Lasavita and Susie Wiles. There was quite a lot of tension there, wasn't there?
Well, that goes without saying. A Trump campaign comes with all of the chaos and the internecine warfare and the backstabbing, and so there was some of that in this campaign, less so than others. But when Corey Lewandowski, who had run Trump's campaign back in 2016 for a while, and managed to ingratiate himself and get back on the campaign plane in 2024, Lewandowski tried to depose, in effect, both Susie Wiles and the co-chair Chris Lasavita. He did a quote unquote audit of campaign finances, basically accused Lasavita of siphoning money away. But in the end, in that showdown, Susie Wiles put her foot down and won that face-off. And she went on, as we all know, to become not only to win the campaign, but to become Donald Trump's White House chief of staff, the first woman ever to hold that title.
And of course, another former campaign manager who features a lot in this book because he's one of your sources is Paul Manafort, who is a figure of great intrigue. What's the relationship between Susie Wiles and Paul Manafort like?
Yeah, again, talk about a rogues gallery. I mean, he was the biggest rogue of all. Paul Manafort, who had gone to prison, served time for money laundering and other crimes, who was caught up in the Russia investigation, went to prison, was pardoned by Trump, and all of a sudden he's back in the saddle, working for Trump and working on his campaign. A little under the radar, but he was talking to me constantly. We would have a weekly Zoom, if not more often, and he would tell me he was certainly had Trump's ear and would tell me what they were up to. So it was a fascinating inside window into the Trump campaign.
Mm. And in fact, amazingly, Paul Manafort predicted almost to the day to you that Biden would pull out the race.
Yeah, it was amazing. I mean, I was texting him right before that fateful weekend of July 2021, 2024, when Joe Biden finally abdicated, stepped away from the ticket, to everyone's surprise at that moment. Nobody knew it was coming. But I texted Manafort that Friday, I think it was, and I said, are you preparing for Kamala or does Joe stay in? And he texted back, Biden out by Monday. And afterwards, looking back, I had to wonder, how in the world did he know that? Maybe a lucky guess, maybe great sources,
or some dark arts, perhaps.
Yeah.
On moving on to the Kamala phase of the Democratic campaign, I was at the convention in Chicago, and I was very struck by how the enthusiasm was a bit odd, I thought, but it was real. There was a brief moment of Kamala mania, but it bubbled up and fizzled out very quickly. What are your insights into that?
Yeah, I thought it was a very well-run convention. There was tremendous excitement. I was there too. I thought she barely put a foot wrong going into that convention. She nailed down the nomination within 48 hours of Biden's announcement. She rallied the troops. Her approval rating spiked by something like 16 points. She came out of that convention, I thought, with real momentum. And then I think the wheels began to come off. I think the campaign got cautious. That's her default mode. She's a very cautious person. For a while, wasn't doing major interviews, and Trump was everywhere. She, of course, never got that Joe Rogan sit down, that influential podcast. And then, of course, there was that disastrous appearance on ABC's program, The View, the American program, where she was asked how she would govern differently, if she would govern any differently from Biden. And she said she couldn't think of a single thing. And boy, was that a turning point and not a good one for her.
Just as a quick note on the Joe Rogan point, I didn't know this until reading your book, that the Kamala's campaign did actually offer Joe Rogan an interview, but said he'd have to come to them, and Rogan
That's
declined,
correct.
which
Yeah.
tells you a lot about the sheer power of some of these podcasters now.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, at the end of the day, I mean, there were people inside the Biden camp who thought that Rogan was beyond the pale, and that she shouldn't do that show. There were some progressives in the campaign, but they wanted to do it. I mean, Jen O'Malley Dillon and the people running the campaign wanted to do it, and ultimately Rogan would not come to them. It's true.
Well, I don't want you to betray any of your sources or anything like that, but I would like to know a little bit about the Biden team, that core team, Don Elon and Ron Klain and so on. There's a feeling, or there were reports certainly, that the Biden families, Jill Biden in particular, they didn't like Kamala Harris. They resented her, and they sort of went along with the campaign. They were never enthusiastic about it. What's your understanding of that?
Yeah, I think that's true. And oddly, I think that Joe Biden had tremendous respect for Kamala Harris and always showed it. In fact, contrary to some other reporting that is out there, I know from my sources that not only did the Biden White House give Kamala Harris the green light to distance herself from Joe Biden on policy if necessary, but that Biden himself called her and said, "Look, do what you have to do." He really respected her. I'm not sure he thought she could win, but at the same time, there was real animosity between the campaign staffs, between the Biden campaign and the Kamala campaign. And of course, the Biden campaign was running Kamala's campaign, Jen O'Malley Dillon and the others. One of the reasons, interestingly, I thought this was fascinating. One of the reasons for that friction is that Joe Biden always treated his staff very, very well. He was never a tough boss in that respect. And the Biden camp felt that Harris was terrible to her staff, and I just found that kind of a fascinating piece of it.
Mm. And there's so many fascinating parts to the story, but a thing that people are very interested in, and rightly so, is the role of Nancy Pelosi, who seems to have been crucial in persuading Biden to go. They had this conversation about America, as she said famously, in which afterwards he did pull out the race. But
Yeah.
is your impression that Nancy Pelosi was not actually enthusiastic about Kamala, and that was part of the problem?
No, I think that's correct. And I think that Nancy Pelosi was for Biden's reelection until she was against it, to use that famous phrase. After the 2022 midterms, when the Democrats had exceeded all expectations and done so much better than anyone thought, Nancy Pelosi was all in for Joe Biden to run for reelection, despite his age. It was only later that she had second thoughts, and then, of course, the debate was the clincher when she knew he couldn't stay in. She delivered that devastating remark on the U.S. program Morning Joe, where she said, it's really up. We're waiting for Joe to make up his mind, in effect, when he'd already said he was running. But then I report for the first time this private meeting they had at the White House. It was a clandestine meeting in the residence, just the two of them, in which they had this long talk about America. She came away from that. She told a friend that I'm the only person who could have delivered that message to him. The message was, you're doing worse than your advisors are telling you. The polls are worse than you think. And Biden wasn't ready to go, but 10 days later, he stepped aside.
I think everybody would agree they wouldn't like to have a long conversation with Nancy Pelosi about America. It could only be bad for your career. I will let you go in a moment, Chris. But just lastly, I would like to talk about the Obamas and the future of the Democratic Party in
Sure.
brief.
Yeah.
It was also felt that the Obamas were very involved in Biden's ouster. I think you get into that, and that's an interesting story in and of itself. But there's also a feeling that chapter now has slightly closed with the Democratic Party, and they don't really have a clear future. Is that the impression you get from your sources, that it was a terrible episode, a kind of tragedy for the party, but now there needs to be something new?
Absolutely. And look, I wrote a book about I wrote my one book about the first 2 years of the Biden White House. This was a consequential presidency. He pulled the economy out of a free fall, passed bipartisan legislation left and right, helped to rally NATO against Vladimir Putin, and yet it all ends in tragedy. And it's an ugly story, and it's a story the Democrats have to acknowledge and move on from. And I don't think Biden's doing anyone any favors by not acknowledging the elephant in the room on this kind of rehabilitation tour that he's out on now. But the Democrats, whoever emerges as a leader of the Democratic Party, is going to have to be someone, in my view, who really owns up to the fact that this was a dark chapter, not a good chapter in the history of the Democratic Party. American voters were misled. Biden left Kamala Harris with too short a runway to have a realistic chance against Donald Trump. And I think you'll see a new leader that'll be kind of an outsider. It'll be someone who, without any connections to Biden world, and there's time. One thing we know is that in 2028, the Democratic nominee, whoever it is, will be the change candidate. That's something that Kamala Harris never could be.
Mm. Well, on that note, we'll end it there, Chris. But thank you very much for coming on to Americano. And again, congratulations on the book. Let me wave it around again. It is excellent.
Thanks so much.
And I recommend everybody read it. Thank you, Chris.